Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Xavier Salomon. I'm the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator here at the Frick Collection. As many of you know, every year we have the Alex Gordon Lecture. Mr. Gordon was a great collector here in New York of European drawings and paintings, of pre-Columbian art, of Russian icons, and he also established a very important library with several thousand volumes. Now, these disparate interests went hand in hand with very generous patronage of public institutions here in the States. So not only here at the Frick Collection, but his estate also funded many scholarships in various art historical fields and supported other programs at the Morgan Library, at the Neuberger Museum of Art, and at Columbia University. We're obviously deeply grateful to Mr. Gordon and to his family for their invaluable support for all these wonderful things, and especially for this lecture. Tonight's speaker is really the perfect speaker for the exhibition that this talk accompanies, the Charterhouse of Bruges exhibition, which will be in the Cabinet Room until the 13th of January, which is one of our exhibitions curated by the Anne Poulet Fellows. And this has been a truly successful and wonderful enterprise by Emma Capron, who has curated this wonderful show, which brings together our Van Eyck with a Petrus Christus painting from Berlin, painted for the same patron, for Jan Voss, for the Charterhouse of Bruges, and together with those two paintings, a series of objects, sculpture, a drawing, and other paintings, and even a prayer bead, to enrich the context of this wonderful painting and bring to life the Charterhouse of Bruges. Now, I think most curators in the world of paintings would have probably stuck to other paintings, and one of Emma's great successes in this project was to bring the material world and the great works of art that are not just flat ones, but also 3D, together to enrich this context. And this should not be surprising, considering that Professor Susie Nash is her professor, and clearly the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. Professor Nash has been really, in many ways, a pioneering art historian in the field of art history, bringing all of these things together, making us understand how these things work together in the very rich context of Flanders, Netherlands, France, mainly in the 15th century. Professor Nash received a PhD with a thesis on medieval manuscripts, manuscript illumination in Amiens in France between 1400 and 1480. And she taught at several prestigious universities in the UK. First, she was a visiting lecturer at Reading between 1987 and 89, and then followed by Birkbeck College and University College London. And in 1993, she started teaching at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, where she's currently Deborah Loeb Brice Professor of Renaissance Art. I'm among the many people who count themselves lucky to have studied and have heard Professor Nash lecture when I was a student there. The focus of her studies have been pretty much the late medieval and Renaissance period. She has produced a very important book on Northern Renaissance art, which is a sort of very important text for anyone approaching that subject for the first time, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2008. She has worked really on a hugely wide range of media. So not only illuminated manuscripts that she did a PhD on, but sculpture, textiles, metalwork, panel painting from all over Northern Europe up to Spain. She is interested in how art was made, used, and viewed. And all of these things together help us understand the material and all of the aspects of the material, from their color to their sort of physical form, but also through the interrogation of primary archival material and printed material, she brings this richness to this world. Between 2005 and 2006, Professor Nash published a series of 3 connected, groundbreaking articles in the Burlington magazine on the Well of Moses by Claus Sluter in the Charterhouse of Champmol in France. And that was the beginning of a long interest in this building, designed for with within the sort of patronage of the Dukes of Burgundy outside of Dijon. And that will be the topic of tonight's lecture, which is entitled Seeing God and the Duke, the Charterhouse of Champmol. I would like to remind you that tonight's lecture is going to be streamed live and will be available on the website, for future viewing. At this point, I would like to ask you all to please turn off your cell phones, and also to let you know that after tonight's lecture, the exhibition, the Charterhouse of Bruges, will be opened until about 7:45, so you will have time to look at it or, well, see it again if you've seen it already. And following tonight's lecture, I also would like to invite you all to join us for a reception and drinks in the garden court just outside this room. So please join me in welcoming Professor Susie Nash. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier, so much. And you reminded me just before we started that we actually saw the One of Moses together many years ago, but when it was boarded up, and actually we had to sort of peer through some fences, I think, to try and see it. Seems a very long time ago, and it feels like I've come a long way in my thinking about that monument since then. So, I am delighted to have been asked by Xavier to speak here at the Frick tonight about a subject that, as you've heard, has consumed a great deal of the last 13 years or so of my scholarly life. Since, on a spring day, in 2005, I managed to persuade a very nice young man at a psychiatric hospital in Dijon to lend me a very long ladder. This, of course, is an embellished view of the event. The man, I think, did look rather like that. I think they've got me to a T, but I think the grounds of the hospital are rather, well, they were rather less lush than that. This may sound a somewhat mystifying, even bizarre way to start a scholarly project, and indeed a lecture. But the psychiatric hospital in question that you see here was built on the ruins of the Charterhouse of Champmol in Dijon, a Carthusian monastery, founded by Philip the Bold, first Duke of Burgundy. Founded by Philip the Bold, first Duke of Burgundy, in the late 14th century as his family mausoleum, and mostly destroyed during the Revolution. And the purpose of the ladder, we move, was to see the top of the 5-meter-high base of a once monumental stone cross constructed in the center of a deep basin of water, set in what was once the great cloister of that Charterhouse, and which is now famously known as the Well of Moses. From that ladder, a great deal else followed. What I could see, what I could deduce from what I could see, and what I saw in a new way. Let me rethink the entire monument and kicked off the wider obsession with the works at Champmol that has led me here tonight. Although the ladder did not, admittedly, provide an authentic or very likely vantage point for any regular 15th century spectator, of course, it was perhaps in many ways emblematic, if not representative, of the challenges of seeing the monuments at Champmol, both in the late Middle Ages and in the more modern period. The nature of a Carthusian monastery is and was, in essence, its enclosure, its separation from the world. While debates might go on as to how isolated the monks who lived in the cells set around the large cloister actually were, the principle was, for most of them, of solitude, silence, constant prayer, and contemplation. The Carthusians, except their priors and procurators, did not routinely go out into the world. They did not preach like the Dominicans or the Franciscans, and their monasteries were sited, if not in the mountains, like their mother house, the Grande Chartreuse, then at least outside the city gates, surrounded by their own walls, sometimes even a moat, guarded by a gatehouse, and insulated from most interactions with outsiders through the benefactors whose land or gifts allowed them to live without seeking alms in the wider world. All this is important when we try to consider the purpose of the works made for these spaces. even a Charterhouse as grand as Champmol was designed primarily for the benefit of the monks who inhabited its grounds, though their purpose was to spend their lives there gathering spiritual benefits for those who endowed them and protected them. The images made for Champmol, and there were many, were directed to the inmates, at least in part, if not experienced by them alone. This was a small but spiritually potent audience, most of whom would spend their entire adult life in this one monastery, this one place, contemplating the images within the walls that enclosed them. Theirs was a viewing experience of a particular nature, immensely deep and slow. Anything set in their visual path must have garnered considerable attention. This attention was rather different, temporally and spatially, to the view of the Duke, his family, and his train, the high-ranking officials and the ecclesiastics, from within and without the order, who might occasionally dine at the Charterhouse and hear Mass, or who packed the monastery on the rare occasions of ducal funerals. Their visual experiences might be relatively brief, but vivid nonetheless. At Champmol, after the monastery was mostly demolished, and the modern hospital built around it, it became a place that was hard to find and uninviting at best for even the keen tourist. When Helen Clay Frick visited Dijon in 1921, she saw the museum, with which she was unimpressed. But she did not venture to the remains of the Chartreuse, even though she was normally an intrepid and determined seeker out of any such attraction in the town she stayed in. And the works at Champmol were the type of object that were, as we have learnt from Emma Capron, capturing her interest at the period. Indeed, many art historians of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century knew the well and the portal from casts alone, examples of which were in Paris, Copenhagen, Berlin, and Brussels. Those who did make it there have stories about strange or surreal encounters with its inmates that still occur from time to time, and that made, in many ways, the works there all the more memorable. While the hospital and its monuments are much more accessible and welcoming today, there are still particular challenges involved in perceiving and understanding the large-scale sculpture, both in situ there and removed, like the tombs of Philip and his son John the Fearless, to the museum in Dijon, and not all of which can be solved with a ladder, however helpful that might still be. These challenges include unpicking their complex histories, reconstructing their original form, understanding their physical evidence and material form, and not least in considering the conditions under which they were viewed, in trying to understand how they might have been approached, understood, valued, and used. Addressing such questions of purpose and context for the Bruges Charterhouse is one of the many wonderful achievements of Emma Capron's current show here, centered on the Frick's Aikian Virgin and Child, which brings together a fascinating and resonant group of objects to explore these issues of function and use. While the works in the show here at the Frick were primarily made for Carthusian priors and monks, at Champmol we have little that comes into that category. The dominant force and the dominating image, at least as emerges from the written and visual evidence, was that of the dukes, and primarily that of his founder, Philip the Bold. Peer of the realm, son of one king, brother to another, and uncle to a third. At Champmol, he is, literally and metaphorically, writ large. Moreover, unlike the Charterhouse of Bruges, which is entirely destroyed, with relatively scanty documentary works, at Champmol, we can see at least some parts of this ducal image in situ. And equally important, we have a vast and still not fully tapped body of documentary evidence about the making, decoration, viewing, protection, and destruction of the monastery and its images that is completely exceptional due to an obsessively organized accounting practice of the ducal court and its officers, and their lucky preservation. No other monastery of the order, indeed I would say no other monument of the later Middle Ages, full stop, has such an extensive and extraordinary documentary record that allows us to interrogate the objects in their ambit and those long since lost so thoroughly. Tonight, I want to use this record to consider 3 images of Philip the Bold created by the Sculpture Workshop in Dijon under Claus Sluter and Claus de Wev between 1389 and 1410. These are, or were, on the portal at the entrance to the church, on the tomb in the monks' choir, on the great cross in the large cloister, and we'll come to some more in a moment. My focus will be primarily on these last two, however, the tomb and the cross, for several reasons, not least that of time. All three are life-sized and in stone, limestone or marble, decidedly monumental and determinedly permanent, or intended to be so, in form if not in surface. All show Philip in different but related ways, and not always alone, but in all he is engaged in prayer or contemplation. As far as we know, these were the only three sculpted images of the Duke in the complex, or certainly the only three life-sized ones. What role his image in the stained glass or painted form might have added to this triangulation of images is impossible to tell, but this sculptural program of effigies is either intact or possible to recreate, enabling an analysis of it as an entity. Moreover, what we can tell from the documentary record, these images and the monuments they were part of were a focus of particular concern, both to the Duke in their creation and to his heirs in their preservation and protection. They worked together in concert, if sequentially, and in different potential combinations or order, I believe, conceived to both be seen and to see, that is, to act as images that memorialize the Duke and encourage prayer for his soul, but that also actively themselves work towards that salvation, set as they are in perpetual prayer or contemplation. At Champmol, this lithic program of effigies entwined with the bodily, actual physical presence of the Duke, in theory, if not always in practice. He wasn't actually there that often, in spaces which the design of the monastery made important accommodation for. These spaces included the two-story ducal oratory, with its views onto the choir and the high altar, and the cell reserved for Philip's intended entrance into the monastery as a monk in his retirement. That's not the cell, that's the crypt, with its views onto the choir and the high altar. The cell reserved for Philip's intended entrance into the monastery as a monk in his retirement, and the sealed crypt that you see there, dug out under the choir, where his body was interred, followed eventually by those of his son and grandson, Philip the Good, and their wives. I want to start with the tomb in the choir of the church and work outwards, considering these three images and the spaces that circle around them or lead to or from them, following initially the route of the monks from the church into the cloister, and then the route of the Duke and his visitors out from the choir through the portal, and finished by climbing the staircase to the oratory, from which a view of both God and the Duke might be attained. Philip's tomb, planned initially in the 1380s, though not installed until 1409, stood ideologically and theologically at the centre of the Charterhouse, in the choir of the church. Its position marked the spot below which Philip's actual body was to be interred, in the first of the ducal crypts. So I'll go back. Dug out for the purpose, created after his death, the entry to which lay under a sealed stone slab in the floor at the head of his tomb. In close proximity were the choir stalls installed in the 1390s that enveloped it on three sides. These stalls were where the monks would sit twice daily to say their offices in full view of the tomb, right in the centre of their space, a constant reminder of the direction of their prayers. In its final form, the tomb must have been an extraordinarily stimulating object on many levels, both visually and semantically. Made of highly polished black and white marble and alabaster, and set with various copper-gilt elements, its base encircled by a procession of clerics, monks, and courtly figures in mourning robes, it was materially the most resonant, the most complex, and I think you can see that from the diagram I've got up there, most complex and certainly the most costly and time-consuming of the sculptural projects undertaken for Champmol, and indeed, I would say surely anywhere in the ducal realm. As installed in the choir, it measured 3.5 by 2.5 meters and was constructed from no less than 770 individual elements, including 52 long-since-lost small angels with copper-gilt wings and an inscription of 420 separately cast and gilded letters, set on a long-since-lost plinth underneath a monolithic slab supporting the effigy. The tomb, as we have it today, however, was not that as originally planned or executed. At some point in 1392, after what amounted to around 35 years of man-hours spent in total by a large team of carvers on a tomb, under his first sculptor, Jean de Marville, Philip abandoned what must have been a virtually completed project and ordered Claus Sluter, by then head of the workshop, to start again from scratch with a new and very different design. This may come as a surprise to those of you who know the monument and its supposed history. The innovative arcade is normally considered to be Marville's design, for instance, but the evidence, when the documents are reread carefully, is clear. That documentary record is, however, both complex and extensive. It contains more than 170 individual entries pertaining to the tomb, made to 73 different craftsmen and women, merchants and suppliers, spread over 7 different types of account over 30-odd years. You may be pleased to know that I won't go into any of its detail tonight, as I have other stories to tell than a tale of 2 tombs. But for anyone who is interested, the arguments are going to be published next year in the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institute. So what is important for our purposes tonight is that Philip's first tomb, as far as can be deduced from the materials Marville acquired for it, among other things, was very different from what we have today. This first version, I argue, was a tall, vertical monument, surrounded and encompassed by a grand limestone canopy of a type that had been built a few decades before at his ducal chapel in Dijon for the previous Capetian Duke of Burgundy. That tomb we know only from documents too, but it was of a type that Philip knew very well from other potent models, papal tombs in Avignon and royal ones in England, where Philip had been held in captivity for many years with his father. It was also a type which had recently been installed at Saint-Denis for his grandmother-in-law, Margaret of Flanders. The canopy, or part of it, still survives, set on the altar. There are many reasons why, in 1380, Philip would have ordered this type of monument. Why this first tomb was abandoned is more intriguing, but also explicable, and some of the reasons must have been to do with Philip's changed political and financial position in the early 1390s. However, among the most important may have been that of visibility. Marville's project, planned in the early 1380s, before Champmol was even designed, and possibly not even at that point for Champmol at all, may now have looked out of place in the church as built, and its vertical form may have posed problems of viewing of all sorts. It would have blocked the views of the monks across the choir and to the high altar, but also of Philip's effigy, which would be much less visible even from the side among the architectural elements. And not at all, perhaps, from the ducal oratory above. That wouldn't be visible at all from the ducal oratory above, at least his effigy wouldn't. By changing to a much wider, lower design and confining the architectural forms to the base of the tomb alone, underneath the vast overhang of the monolith on its top, the impact was twofold. It created a monument that relied for its splendor on the quality and surface treatment of the materials, and it made the effigy, the image of the Duke, far more visible. His body and its presentation being the central focus, rather than a complex array of architectural forms surrounding it. That this was a decided and very costly change suggests that such considerations were or had become of importance. In considering Sluter's new design, the visual impact and resonance of the polished black marble on this tomb and the chromatic contrast it provided should not be underestimated. Although the combination of polished black and white marble was well established for royal and other high-status tombs going back to the late 13th century, and Marville's first tomb would have exploited it to an extent, the size, quality, and technical virtuosity of the huge single monolithic block that formed the top section on Philip's tomb was exceptional, and remained so. I don't think there was another slab of black marble as big used anywhere on a tomb at this period. Just possibly Margaret of Austria at Brou managed to acquire one, but it wasn't nearly the quality of this. As we know from an unpublished payment for its lengthy and costly transport from Dijon, before cutting, it measured 12 by 8 Dijon foot, or nearly 4 meters by 2.5 meters, and would have weighed nearly 4 tons. The finest quality Dijon, only available from that region, has virtually no veins or fossils, no white quartz markings in it, with just very, very occasional formations of such. But it's very, very difficult to get that very, very pure black without any of the white quartz in it. But at Dijon you could get this. It provided the blackest black and the highest shine. Sluter's block remarkably has no white quartz inclusions at all, and finding one so large that was so unblemished must have been a feat in itself. It was by far the most expensive, risky, and technically challenging part of the whole monument, the top and bottom blocks costing in total nearly 1,200 livres, including transport, 3 times that of the white marble for the effigy sourced via Paris from Italy. The mineral quality that made this black marble able to take such a high polish also made it notoriously difficult and time-consuming to work, requiring specialist carvers and dedicated polishers. Indeed, Albertus Magnus, in his treatise on mineralogy, claimed that black marble could not be cut, only polished. The technical virtuosity and material value of Philip's tomb must have been understood then as much in the amazing undulating profiles achieved in this stone and its astonishing high sheen as in the other extraordinary aspects of its form. The process of delivering, installing, and working this block was in itself dramatic, performative, risky, and surely memorable, leaving physical traces on the church itself, as well, surely, as in the memories of the monks who by then were living in the Charterhouse and worshipping in the church. When it arrived in Dijon in November 1402, it was taken directly to Champmol. Sluter's workshop in the ducal palace could not clearly accommodate it, or it was too risky to move it in and then out again, but it was equally difficult to get it into the church. To do so, a hole had to be knocked through the wall of the chancel, since presumably the choir screen and the choir stores, by then in place, meant it could not go through the portal, and certainly not through its doors, I think. That the chances of breaking this valuable block were high, and the consequences of doing so severe, are acknowledged in Sluter's contract that he signed in 1404 with the new Duke for the tomb's completion, where he's freed of any liability for damage to the slab during its working or installation. And although it did survive unbroken under Sluter's careful working of it, and it also survived being moved out of the church at the Revolution into Saint-Benin, and then eventually from Saint-Benin to the Musée des Beaux-Arts. As it was carried in there, it unfortunately broke into 3 pieces and crushed a worker in the process. Once inside the choir, the unworked block must have been carved and polished in the center of this functioning liturgical space, as there was nowhere else it could go, no other doors large enough to get it through. Once it was in through the wall of the chancel, basically, that was where it had to sit. The situation must have established an unusual and intimate relationship between the block and the monks in the choir, who would have witnessed its creation, the slow rhythm of which lasted for several years, while the carvers and the specialist polishers worked on the block in the day, and the monks had their offices in the choir stall around it, in the depths of the night and the dusk of the evening. They would literally have seen its form emerge from the block, and the material transformed from a dull grey, which is what it looks like when it hasn't been polished, into the deepest black, creating with it a mass of black dust. That there was something of deeper significance to this process and potentially elemental about the dust itself is hinted at by the Ménagier de Paris writing in the early 15th century, who recommended dust from the cutting of the black marble blocks used for tombs as the ingredient for making sand for hourglasses. Its fine crystalline structure would have made it perfect for this use indeed. The term the Ménagier uses for the dust, limone, is interesting, as it has been mistranslated as grease, but it is the word used by writers like Christine de Pizan for the biblical dust God used to form the body of Adam. That dust from these royal tombs, tied etymologically to the process of creation, might have been collected from the polishing of Philip's tomb to make hourglasses out of, is a very attractive idea, but one for which I have absolutely no evidence, unfortunately. On this polished surface, once completed and installed, was set the effigy of the Duke, What the monks saw, however, and what we see today was rather different. With careful consideration of the visual and documentary sources, we can, however, reimagine the original form of the monument that appears so intact and so convincingly authoritative in its recreation in the Musée des Beaux-Arts today, but which is, in fact, deceptive in several ways, which have neither been recognized nor explored, at least not all of them. The first is its base. The section here, now made of black marble inset with white sections to form a cross, was in fact originally made of red stone, which you can see, I think, very clearly from this drawing. So made of red stone inset with a black cross. The red was a locally sourced pinkish limestone, treated to look like red marble. This is evident from payments for its delivery and working, but also from the drawings that you see here over the tomb before its dismantling at the Revolution, and other descriptions of it at the period. The decision to set the tomb on what was in effect an imitation red marble created a dramatic visual contrast, emphasizing the overhang. I hope I've got, no, maybe not. Emphasizing the overhang of the huge monolith, creating this dramatic contrast and bringing with it a range of possible associations to which we will return. So the second deceptive element is the effigy itself. While it is, of course, well known that the figure of the Duke is in large part a 19th century restoration, most of his figure was destroyed at the Revolution, the remarkable restraint of the colour of the original and the significance of that restraint has gone unrecognised. On the tomb as we have it today, only the lion, the hands, the helm, and the angels are original, along with the sections of the robe at either side of the figure, carved separately from the main block and beautifully worked to imitate ermine. This was only relatively recently recognised that the areas of the cloak are actually part of the original figure. This was in the recent restoration. They recognised this. The figure created by the 19th century sculptor for the then director of the museum, Fèvre de Saint-Mamin, while incorporating these elements, was not true to the original in terms of either its size, its form, or its colour. Philip's effigy was originally less tall. The lion sat on the robes actually much further up. You've got to imagine the lion up where his feet are. And importantly, there was a very, very different chromatic contrast. So, what you see here, for example, none of this fussy blue bits of gold fringed cloth under the lions and the angels are original. They're all 19th century. They were inserted to hide the damage to the slab caused in its move. And just as disturbingly, the outer part of the Duke's mantle has been painted blue, presumably to help integrate it with the new sections at his shoulders. When this replacement figure was made, the sculptor only had available to him an engraving, uncoloured of course, and that showed the figure from one side only, which is why you get no armour on the Duke. But I think you can see from this photoshopped image how different chromatically the original effigy would have been once we take out the blue sections and take out the blue painting of the robe. Philip is a primarily white figure, and the marble would have shone through very wonderfully. But, of course, the reason that it looks, in part why it looks so different, is they didn't have any colour models to use at the time. They only had I'm sorry, that's my slide that shows you gives a vague idea of what the red base would have looked like. So when they were recreating the figure, they only had an engraving to work from, only showed one side, and of course it didn't show any colour. However, if we look at these drawings by Jacques-Philippe Gilquin, which were made before 1736, we get a very different idea of what the tomb would have looked like in terms of its chromatic contrasts. They help reinforce the accuracy. Also, we have other drawings by other painters from around the same period that are very consistent in this. So this is not just one artist's view of it. What they show, as I've said, is the figure was predominantly white with some touches of gilding across its form, but the colour that was employed was highly focused. It is all around the head of the figure, with the blue of the cushion and the tip of the sceptre, the strong red of the padding inside the helm, and the flesh colouring of the face and the hands, held close up to it in prayer. On the tomb, this minimal colour directs the viewer then to the face of the Duke and his act of prayer. But as well as a visual cue, it was also meaningful. Red, white, blue, gold, and black, while not uncommon combinations, were the colours of the Burgundian ducal coats of arms. The red marble base of the tomb itself would also have had many possible connotations, from the funerary ones of porphyry, perhaps, but also to associations with the Holy Sepulchre, believed to have been made of red marble, but also to Carthusian ideals expressed in their devotional texts that associated red with charity and their desire and the monks' desire to be crucified with Christ. But more than anything, perhaps, the whiteness of the figure of the Duke would have resonated strongly with the Carthusian viewer, associating him symbolically with their order, whose white robes formed such an important part of their identity. Philip, his actual body, dressed in the white robe of a Carthusian in the crypt below, he was buried in a Carthusian robe, we remember, was very much in principle, if not in actuality, one of their own. The Duke's bodily interment and the material of his effigy symbolized and indeed enacted the desire he had apparently expressed in life to enter the monastery himself in his later years, for which, as I've said, a cell had been put aside for the purpose. Moreover, the monks would have seen him doubly as one of them, since on his death he had been symbolically welcomed into the order. He'd been given privileges strictly reserved for the Carthusian brothers of a tricentenary and anniversary mass celebrated in perpetuity for his soul by the entire order. The design of the tomb and its effigy thus walks a line between maintaining its regality, astonishingly so perhaps with its sceptre and ermine, reminding us he was regent of France, while allowing for his professed desire to end his life as a Carthusian, to be equally visible to the monks of the order who contemplated the tomb and prayed for his soul every day. That the monks could have seen the effigy of Philip more easily than we can today is also evident. It was simply more visible then than it is now, as the entire tomb was lower. The first layer of the base it is now sat on, a foot high, under the reconstructed black marble layer, was also added in the 19th century, when the tombs were installed in the Musée des Beaux-Arts. It is clear that in the church there was no such extra platform, and clear from a whole range of evidence. Its purpose must have been in part museological, to raise the level of the arcade to make viewing the famous pleuron figures easier. But the original lower position for both of them, that for the pleurons and the effigy, would have changed the experience of viewing the tomb, placing the figure of the Duke closer to eye level. For the monks who sat on the choir stalls that usually had raised platforms, so they could have been actually quite high up, and for those walking around the monument. In the dark of the nighttime offices, the black marble may have dissolved into the dark of the church, and the body of the Duke might have appeared to float. While we can only speculate on such visual possibilities, what is clear is that in broader terms, the understandable appeal of the pleurons has skewed the view of the tomb for most of the last 200 years, both in the art historical literature and in the popular imagination. Indeed, it was the pleurons, when seen extracted from their architectural setting on the tomb, that most appealed to Helen Clay Frick on her visit to the Cluny, where some of them were displayed in that same trip of 1921, an appeal that continues in the evident success of the recent American tour of those from the tomb of John the Fearless. It's amazing what you can do with them when you cut them out, isn't it? The need to redirect our contemporary eyes back to the effigy does not mean that the arcade with the pleurons did not also draw the focused attention of the historical viewer. The gleaming copper-gilt letters of the long-lost inscription, which listed Philip's pedigree and titles, unusually placed under the very deep overhang and directly above the arcade, would have drawn the viewer down to this area, even if they'd had to crouch down more than they do today. Inscriptions are usually set around the edge of the upper slab. It's very unusual to have an inscription in this position. Why Sluter didn't do it, I think, is intriguing. It may have been too risky to carve into this incredibly valuable black slab. He might not have wanted to spoil the unblemished and uninterrupted surface, I think. What drove him is hard to untangle. Sluter's designs, I think, are often a complex interweaving of form, meaning, and materials, and with solutions to technical problems closely entwined with iconographic and formal innovation. And just to give you a sense of the kind of normal place for an inscription, this is a tomb from Souvigny, which actually in its contract was specified as to follow the tomb of Philip the Bold in all its details, but obviously not in this one. Well, in the end, they didn't follow it in that one. The inscription starts at Philip's head and works necessarily anti-clockwise around the tomb, sending its reader against the force of the procession, which moves clockwise towards this point. But it seems unlikely the monks, so aware of their founder and his status, and their duty to pray for him, were the main or intended audience for this particular text, and its exhortation at its end, that you see here, set directly below the Duke's head to pray devoutly for his soul. And I think that's something, of course, they would need little reminding of. Now, the meaning and experience of the Duke's tomb was, however, to be both expanded and compromised in the early years after its creation by several alterations to the space around it. The first of these was almost immediate. The erection of railings stated as to protect the tomb from being damaged, its images from being stolen, by whom is not clear. And it could indeed, I think, have been the inmates. I think all those little angels, which have long since gone and we've got no idea what they look like, you could imagine them being very appealing to want to take them back to your cell and handle them. And I do wonder if actually it wasn't people from outside who were stealing them, but it could have been the inmates. So these railings can be envisaged by comparison with a similar protective measure erected around the tomb of Juan of Castile that you see here, in another Carthusian monastery at Miraflores, near Burgos. We do not know if those at Champmol were like these and had spikes to set candles on. But if so, their effect, set so close to the lustrous surface, is another factor that we can only imagine, but that should be borne in mind in considering the original viewing context. Soon after, the railings were erected, before 1420, and I think most probably under Philip's son, John the Fearless. An altar was set up right at the head of the tomb. The decision to set this altar must have been in large part due to the positioning of the tomb so far from the only other altars in the choir, the high altar, on which sat a shining embryarchy triptych, and the chancel altar behind it, on which sat the crucifixion retabub by Jacques de Baza that we saw briefly earlier. So that Philip's tomb was at a physical distance from the masses said there. This placement of Philip's tomb at the entrance to the choir is absolutely clear from many sources, but because the primary, most prestigious position was directly in front of the altar, it has been assumed or asserted in the literature that Philip's tomb, as the founder, was placed there, and then that of his son, John's, was set behind it. The choice that was made, however, with John set instead at the feet of his father, ad pedis patrae, as stated in the necrology of the monastery, is highly significant for the dynastic message of Champmol. It presents a visual expression of lineage and ducal power, akin to the visual expression of genealogy in a family tree or a tree of Jesse. From Philip springs John, his heir, and from John, his heir Philip the Good, whose tomb in turn, you see just signified by a black rectangle here because he never got round to actually completing it. It really was just a black slab at this point in the choir, was marked out there at the feet of his father. At this point, you can't go any further. There's no one else, really no more room to bury anyone. You've done your lineage. But the position of the successive crypts dug out with each burial also follows this. So that they dig the crypts underneath each tomb in that successive line that we saw there. So the bodies, as well as the effigies, are placed in this genealogical order. Because the effigy on any tomb had to face the altar, with its feet to the east and its head to the west, the only way to ensure this highly charged arrangement of sons at their father's feet was to set Philip back from the more sacred space and place John in front of him. The visual impact, then, of the tombs in the choir for those entering from the church itself through the choir screen or via the small cloister was of a line of succession and power from Philip to Jean. Continuity was underlined by this placement, as well as by the meaningful and deliberate decision to make the tombs the same as each other. This mimicking of one object in the other was not some sort of creative laziness on the part of the patron or artist, of course, but a considered strategy that reinforced, conveyed, and instilled the power of the one duke into the other. Of course, in the choir at Champmol, there was no competition from other tombs and memorials. This space was entirely in the control of the dukes, and their tombs were the dominant focus. Placement was not about jostling for position in a crowded abbey or town church, or something to be influenced by proximity to the bodies of saints or liturgical rites. The presence of the new altar, however, while solving one problem, created another. The start of the procession and the inscription and the section of the tomb at Philip's head would now be much harder to view, while not impossible, of course. These are the only views we have of the inside, virtually the only views we have of the inside of the church at Champmol. And unfortunately, they were made after it was completely remodeled in the 18th century, and they took out all the original choir stalls. So it gives us some sense of it, but not what we might want. So, the start of the procession, the inscription, and the section on the tomb at Philip's head would now be much harder to view. We can't know how hard up against the tomb the altar was set, but with this and the railings and Jean's tomb set quite close to it, it seems, I think circumnavigating the monument must have been made more tricky. It's the way we tend to view the tomb today, but I think it would have actually been quite difficult to do at the time. Certainly, when John's tomb was put up, there is also a suggestion that the railings might have encompassed both of them, so you just couldn't walk round one and another. It did, however, provide a whole new potential array of imagery, this is the altar, and visual prompts around the locus of Philip's head. Well, what we see here is an 18th century arrangement, as I've said. The original altar would necessarily have had a cross of some sort, and as far as we know, there was nothing in terms of arretable made for it. So the possibility that over the head of Philip, flanked by two angels, a cross was visible must certainly be entertained, which leads us, of course, to the great cross in the cloister, where Philip stood, flanked by angels, and below a very tall cross. So if we leave the choir, following the routes the monks would take after matins and vespers, we go through the centre of the choir screen and out into the small cloister, and from there to the large cloister, around which the cells were set. I have slightly altered the map there, I think, but I hope it makes sense. It was in the centre of this space that the most intriguing, theologically and personally complex image of the Duke was set on the hexagonal base of the Great Cross with which we started. Begun in 1394 and completed 10 years later, the cross was planned directly after Sluter redesigned the tomb, which brings these two works much closer formally and conceptually than has previously been recognised, although I won't be able to talk about those former relationships at all today. To understand the image of the Duke on this monument, we need briefly to review the larger object of which it was part. This presented another, if rather different technical challenge for Sluter's workshop to create this time a limestone cross over 9 meters tall, set in a marshy ground of the monastery, to be seen from a distance and in the round, emerging out of a basin of water and open to the elements. Its installation, like the tomb, was also challenging and certainly dramatic, needing a crane to erect the 7-meter-tall cross and its column, which sat on the terrace, a large quantity of lead and a long iron rod to seal and secure it. It was a feat of engineering, as well as a design of intricate and nuanced rhythm and meaning. What survives today is just the base of the monument. I show you here some images which I hope give you a sense of both its dramatic scale and the complexity of it as a feat of engineering and just how deep into the well the column goes. So what survives today is just the base of the monument, a hexagonal pillar set with 6 life-size figures of Old Testament prophets. The cross set on the terrace collapsed at some point before the Revolution. As far as we can reconstruct this upper part, and what I could deduce in part from up the ladder, is that at its base the Magdalene was alone. Her arms, the only part of her to survive, they're very beautifully carved, she must have been the most amazing figure, wrapped around the cross. The cross itself was aligned to face out over the point of the hexagon, above the angel, in white with crossed arms, and between David and Jeremiah. It is here, in the guise of Jeremiah, that we find the image of Philip. Another revelation from the ladder. Portraits of this sort, not disguised but in the guise of, should not surprise us. They were well known in the 14th and 15th centuries at the courts of Europe, though more often the guise adopted was one of the three kings or the prophet David. The reasons why Philip might have chosen to be shown as Jeremiah here on the cross in this space are complex and entwined with Carthusian as well as ducal interests, but increasingly I am coming to think that the words Jeremiah speaks and that then become Philip's own are central to that choice and to the meaning of his image here, to which we will return. Now, while the tomb relied for its impact on the luster and sheen of its polished materials and their dramatic chromatic contrasts, the great cross was made splendid and memorable in different ways, in part through its scale, its dramatic figures, and the technical feat of its creation, but also through its extremely rich and very beautifully applied polychromy and gilding, undertaken by the ducal painter Jean Mauwel, who must have worked closely with Sluter in the conception of how colour might complement and make meaningful its form. The polychromy used a vast amount of gold leaf, and it used ultramarine, which is exceptional in polychrome sculpture. This is something that we very rarely find. Usually there's just azurite, but here no expense, maybe unsurprisingly, was spared. But here the colour is also both symbolic and heraldic. It is used to mark the monument with the ducal arms, noticeably absent from the tomb, now faded to mere traces. We see them here, set in roundels framed by sunbursts on the base of each side of the hexagon, below each prophet, just above the waterline. It's also used, colour that is, in more subtle ways. The angel marking the front of the cross between David and Jeremiah is painted in Carthusian white, in a robe in the same form, patterned with the same gold stars as that at the duke's right-hand shoulder on the tomb. While the angel marking the back axis of the cross is dressed in green, red, and black, that are the colours of Philip's son, John the Fearless. And I've shown you a small detail there just to pick out the black, because black is not a colour that you polychrome sculpture. This is very clearly a heraldic reference to John. It's also used to mark out Philip here, as his robes are painted with an unusual combination of layers of red ochre and azurite to create the effects of deep red purple, which was the colour of the robes he wore in life, lined with green, another favourite colour, and that he alone among the prophets wears. So while on the tomb, the invitation to view the figure of the Duke was made through its design, through the limited chromatic range and lustre of its materials. On the great cross, the image of the Duke, Jeremiah, actively invites the viewer to look at the monument and at his effigy on it, through his words and through his actions. Jeremiah's own act of seeing, of course, is made manifest in one of the more important missing details, of course, his metal eyeglasses, which Philip himself, of course, wore. These were provided by the ducal goldsmith, reimagined here in this 19th century engraving. There's absolutely no trace of them, but it gives you some sense of maybe what they would have looked like. The book he reads from is not a normal attribute of a prophet either. Their identifying feature, usually, are scrolls. Books are for apostles and saints. While Jeremiah is not alone on the cross in having one, Isaiah holds one too. Jeremiah's is open, and on it was painted a legible text. But legible only, in fact, to Jeremiah Philip, or indeed to someone up a ladder. It's now, unfortunately, indecipherable. I live in hope. I think the only way may be to visit the monument in the dark and use UV, and I'm not sure I can pull that one off, but, you never know. From Jeremiah's book unfurls another text. And the prophet's own words, designed to be read not by Philip Jeremiah, but by the spectator below. The text is from Lamentations, which bewails the fall of Jerusalem. And it is an explicit exhortation to the viewer to look. All ye who pass by the way, attend and see, if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow. This is the only prophecy on the well that addresses the viewer, and in the first person. It is written upwards, unlike the text on the other scrolls the prophets hold, and which enables the two words that are most prominent and legible to be videte, see, and dolor, sorrow. You see there. The combination of the eyeglasses, the book, and the prophecy thus make the invitation to see here palpable. But what is enshrined in the very form of the cross is that it can only be seen. Set in the basin of water, 7.5 meters across, it was very evidently not touchable. It had its own moat, in effect. Its isolation was more emphatic originally, since there was no platform around its inside. The platform that you see there is built, actually this one's relatively recent. In the 19th century, they built a platform that was up at the level, almost at the level of the prophets above. Relatively recently, they restored it to the ground level, which makes the viewpoint on the well much more appropriate. But it also still means that we're much too close to it, because originally this building didn't have a door, and you weren't expected to go in it, the building they built in the 17th century to try and further protect it. And so you would only view it from a distance of outside those buildings' walls, not inside, as we see it today. The physical inaccessibility of the pillar and the prophets is surely, however, one of the things that was responsible for its remarkable state of preservation to this day, so we have to be grateful for it. This great cross and the figure of Philip Jeremiah at its base was only visible, however, in its full splendor for a very short period after its completion in 1404. Just 18 months later, the new Duke, John the Fearless, ordered what can only really be described as a very large tent, made of 256 alms of waxed cloth, to be erected around it, with the purpose, articulated in the accounts, of protecting the work from being damaged by the elements. The form of the cross had created a relatively immediate and evident problem. Its costly and meaningful surface would not last that long out in the wind and the rain. Actually, it was a really crazy thing to do when you think about it. I mean, the whole cross was gilded, and it must have started to look damaged very, very quickly. Indeed, 2 more years after the original tent, a more durable wooden structure replaced it, again on the Duke's orders, as the first tent was already leaking. So, the tent and its replacement solved one problem, but created another. The cross, designed to be a highly visible focus for the monks' devotions and contemplation, could no longer be seen, at least from any distance. In protecting the monument, it must have been less frequently venerated, now hidden away under the tent. This was a concern for Philip's son Jean, and continued to be for Jean's son Philip the Good, is indicated by the granting of a series of indulgences, clearly at the request of the dukes. The first of these was made under John the Fearless by Cardinal Giordano Orsini and given in April 1418, coinciding with the visit of the Duke and the Cardinal to Champmol to celebrate the anniversary of his father's death, that is Jean's death, Philip the Bold's death, in that month. The second was given by Cardinal Albergati in 1432, and the third by Petrus de Monte in 1443. I think probably all these dates are significant, but I haven't got time to go into that now. These indulgences promised remission of normally 40 days for the faithful, to visit the cross and say certain prayers in its presence. The faithful, either specified as such or implicit in their wording, were not outsiders. Priors, monks, clergy, lay brothers, and others living in the actual precinct of the aforesaid monastery is the wording of Albergati's indulgence. Their purpose is also very clear, most explicitly in that of 1443, which states it is granted so the cross would be more fervently, devoutly, and efficaciously visited and venerated, which involved, of course, approaching it from inside its tent and seeing its actual form. And just as Jean Voss's indulgences elicited prayers for his soul in the pictures that we have in the exhibition here, these also did for the soul of the Duke, these indulgences, since their modest value, very far from the inflated offerings of thousands of years on offer at more accessible sites, made them something that would not attract pilgrims in any way, and needless to say, the great cloister was not a place they would have been that welcome. Moreover, the prayers required to gain them would be said by the monks themselves, and thus would be, as all their devotions were intended to be, directed at the salvation of the soul of the Duke. The imagery of the cross they would be confronted with when saying them would remind them emphatically of that purpose. That the monument was actively venerated was of particular concern to John and then his son Philip for reasons that go beyond a desire to ensure prayers for the soul of their ancestors. The cross and the figure of Philip Jeremiah on it had a deeper Burgundian meaning that meant both preserving its surface and ensuring its veneration was a ducal, not just a Carthusian priority. The Great Cross was, I would argue, in effect, a war memorial to the disastrous Battle of Nicopolis and a vast loss of life that occurred in 1396 in the crusade coordinated by Philip the Bold and led by the young and then unblooded John the Fearless, a disaster that occurred just after the monument was begun. To understand this, we have to go back to the words of Jeremiah, which are a lament, but not just for the crucifixion set above. These words were well known and adopted at the time as potent for expressing the deepest of sorrow, of mourning for personal loss, not just the sorrow of the crucifixion or that of the Magdalene above at the event, though they certainly did that too. Moreover, what the verse goes on to lament are losses in battle at the siege of Jerusalem. The Lord hath trodden underfoot all my mighty men in the midst of me. He hath called an assembly against me to crush my young men. By 1400, when the prophets were being carved, Philip the Bold's sorrow for the losses of Nicopolis were legendary, publicly expressed and very real. Some of his closest friends and advisors had died. Thousands of his men had been captured and slaughtered. His son forced to watch as they were hacked to pieces. Philip managed to ensure the return of John and some of the other French nobility, but the impact on France and Burgundy psychologically was immense and cannot be overstated. It was a national disaster of epic proportions in both loss of life and a changed worldview. This was the late 14th century French equivalent of 9/11. The cross and the figure of Jeremiah Philip might then, it seems, have been intended not just to evoke the act of seeing and devotion, but to elicit mourning and memorialize loss. In the outpouring of literature at the time bewailing the disaster, it is frequently Jeremiah who is evoked as the model for the sorrow of France and for the much-lauded sorrow of the Duke. There are, I think, many further aspects of the monument that support this reading that I can't go into now, but perhaps most telling is that the early modern writers record the date of the monument. And this date must have been inscribed somewhere on or near it, though it's now lost, and that date they give as September 1396. Now, this is neither the date the project was begun, which was 1394 to 5, nor is it the date on which it was erected, the cross that is, 1399, nor is it the date it was finished, 1404, but it is, of course, the date of the Battle of Nicopolis. This monument worked then, like so many at Champmol, on several levels. It did double duty, commemorating the sorrow of the sacrifice of the crucifixion above and the sorrow of the Duke's own sacrifice below, the invitation to stop and see, evoking the prayers of the monks for the Duke, but potentially, by extension, to all those lost at Nicopolis and for the realm of France more widely. If we leave the cloister and return to the church, we can see how the image of Philip Jeremiah on the cross and the image of Philip on the tomb could resonate. The angel that I mentioned already at the head of the Duke at his right-hand shoulder, who looks out at the spectator, is in white, wearing the same robes, decorated with the same gold stars, which I think may potentially have Carthusian significance, but they're also an emblem that Philip used, and that's set at his right-hand shoulder on the well and also his right-hand shoulder on the tomb. The addition of the altar at the head of Philip, if indeed set with a cross at the time, as we've seen, would make the relationship even clearer. From the choir, if we take the more public route, we come to the third image in stone of Philip, which I will touch on only briefly, though that is not to say it was without significance or importance for how the Duke was seen at Champmol. This is the image in prayer on the portal, presented not by his patron, Philip, but by John the Baptist, a saint of great importance to the Carthusians, of course. He presented an important model for their hermetic lifestyle. But he was also a saint with important royal connections for his role in having anointed Christ. Indeed, Here the Duke's royal pedigree is emphasized with his ermine robe and originally what must have been some sort of jeweled circlet around his head, of the type he wore on the tomb. And he kneels not on the rocky ground that the saint is kneeling on, but actually on a cushion that's quite hard to see. Like the cross, this work was protected from the elements not long after it was made. And like the cross, this was done under John the Fearless, by a roof structure specified again as to protect the images from being damaged by the elements. This suggests the whole was originally painted, at least in part. Now, a restoration long overdue might solve this question. There aren't any traces visible of polychromy on it, but I think actually it may have a coating over its entire surface, and if they could remove it, I would be very interested to see what they might find. At present, the only touches visible are in the eyes, and I think these were probably redone perhaps at a later period, but one would imagine they would originally have had polychromy of some sort. Philip's image on the portal thus shows him certainly seeing God in the form of the Christ child, a vision he shares with his wife, Margaret of Flanders, whose image seems only to have been present at this outer limit of the church, as while her coat of arms and the letters M for her name were present throughout the monastery. She is neither entombed inside nor represented beyond this point in portraiture. That this image of the Duke and the Duchess and their mode of portrayal was also of particular concern to the Duke is indicated by the fact that its design was also the result of a rethink, the whole overhauled by also under Sluter, just like the tomb, and just a year or two before the change of plan for the tomb. As far as we can tell, the initial plan was for 3 figures of the Duke, the Duchess, and the Virgin, expanded then to 5, and transformed into what was probably standing donor figures. This is all well known. The portal redesign thus focused on the act of prayer very decisively, something made far more visible from a different view, and one that, as far as I know, has never been considered or photographed. This is the view seen on leaving the church, although perhaps only visible on certain occasions when the entire doors were open, and of course presumably they would have had a small door within the door that you maybe went through more regularly. As the viewer walks from the tomb in the choir out through these doors, what is made most prominent are the hands of the Duke and the Duchess, though hers are now missing. Their gestures of prayer protrude emphatically into the space of the doors, silhouetted against the light. Like the tomb, with its emphasis on the hands of the Duke and its invocation to pray for his soul, the prompt to prayer at the portal was both visual and textual. In 1394, 2 wooden tablets inscribed with prayers had been set inside the porch, but outside the doors, so in direct juxtaposition with the praying figures of the Duke and the Duchess. Indeed, it seems not without some irony that the hands on both the tomb and the portal were to become, in a sense, relics in their own right, fragments of significance that were stolen and preserved. Those on the tomb were saved by the local historian and collector, Louis Benin Baudot, and then given by him to the museum to be reconstructed back into their remade figure of the Duke. The hands of Philip on the portal are actually original, but they were stolen in 1836 and then returned, hung over the door of the curator's office at the museum, which he found there one morning when he came back to work. Having moved out of the church, I want to finish tonight with one final viewpoint, just briefly, that of the ducal oratory. This, as far as we know, did not contain an image of the Duke, but it did, of course, contain the Duke himself and allowed him from its tall vantage point to see, but not to be seen, and of course the Duke and future Dukes. This 2-story structure had a lower and upper chapel, richly appointed, lined with Baltic oak panelling, and with their own fireplaces, their own altars and images, but of which we have almost no physical trace today. I do not want to go into what was inside these spaces today. What I'm showing you here is just an evocation of the oratory in the church in Bruges of Louis of Grutu's, just to give you a sense of what the oratory at Champmol might have looked like, and its particular, the possibility of the views it might have given. So I don't want to go into what was inside these spaces today, but rather to consider what could be seen from them. We know that both the lower and upper story had windows to allow for a view onto the high altar. In the process of making and expanding these, we are told their purpose in the accounts, so that the Duke can see God from above. This meant on the high altar, where the view would allow the Duke to participate in the ocular communion when Mass was said there. From the upper windows, too, it seems likely that the dukes could have looked down on the tombs, a view that can be approximated, at least in part, from the left-hand side of the balcony today in the Salle de Garde, but which I think is actually very hard to envisage. But from the oratory, another view, out from the church, may have been just as important. Like the tomb and the portal, at around the same period, the oratory underwent a remodelling, and in this case, the purpose of it was also specified. The windows were altered because the light they provide, but also the view from them, was not sufficient, and it's needed to be good. In another document, work on the staircase for the oratory refers to it as being made for the view. By chance, this staircase does survive, and its form is remarkable in ways that have never been noted, but which suggest how important seeing was at Champmol. On the first floor, the entrance to the upper chapel, its form is interrupted by what is now bricked up but must have been a large open window. And then, although it only needed to feed this one story, the staircase continues to nothing but the turret above, in which are set a series of windows that all face outward, to the direction, as repeatedly termed in the Champmol accounts, towards the mountain, de vers la montagne. Perhaps this was simply a watchtower, but its presence here on the oratory, whose access was primarily ducal rather than monastic, makes it plausible that this presented a space for the duke to view his domains, but in a manner that was spiritual rather than political. Contemporaries were exhorted to raise their minds and their eyes from earthly objects to understand heavenly truths through the contemplation of creation, through high places, rivers, trees, and mountains. Here, it is worth, I think, drawing this back round to the pictures in the present show, and to other works made by Van Eyck himself, Petrus Christus, that seem to work with the same purpose in mind. In the views, seen from up high, they present, often including mountains. From the oratory and its tower, and there wasn't really a mountain in Dijon, I should say, but there was quite a tall hill. It's impossible to understand today. Most of it's been completely cut away as they quarried the stone from it, but that's the way they referred to that view in the Champmol accounts. So, I think that these images worked in the same way. From the oratory and its tower, the Duke could see God on the high altar, and his heirs could have seen him on the tomb below. But he and they might also have been able to contemplate God in creation in the views out to the lands of which he was a lord. So, the story of these ducal monuments, their construction, remodeling, protection, destruction, reconstruction, and restoration is far from being fully told here tonight. They are objects rich with layers of meaning and reading, indeed of seeing. Their purpose was the same, if on a more monumental scale, and in a more political landscape, as the Frick Virgin with its Carthusian prior Jean Vos. Commemoration, memory, and salvation, enticement to pray, activated in the act of their being seen, encouraged by indulgences, but also working as images of prayer in perpetuity, with the act of the Duke and of De Vos in seeing God. Thank you.